Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor of ClassicsToday.com, here with my ideal list of Haydn string quartets. All of them. Yes, all 68 and a half string quartets. It's really quite a list, but unlike the symphonies, which you really have to take individually until you get to the Paris symphonies and the London symphonies, where you get two useful clumps that you can basically consider as a whole, with the string quartets, they were published in groups of 6 for the most part, and so we have opus numbers and can handle each opus number or group of 6. Sometimes they share 2 opus numbers. You'll see when we get there. But we can at least deal with those as a group and get through them with a reasonable number of ensembles, because for each opus number or group that Haydn wrote, I'm going to choose a different string quartet. And I think that's the way to do it, because as I've said with these ideal lists, I want not only to get through some of the best performances of each work, but also to let you know who the best ensembles are, so that you can collect them and pursue it on your own once you hear them. There's no reason, of course, that you need to hear all the ones I recommend. If you find a string quartet that I like and they did more than just the usual batch, go ahead, by all means. Follow your own ears, follow your gut, follow your instinct. You don't have to take my word for it. I'm just trying to give you a sample of what's out there so that you can make intelligent and informed choices. That's what it's all about in the wacky world of classical record collecting. Now, let's start with the quartets, Opus 1 and 2. Here's the thing. Haydn's early quartets were called quartet divertimentos. Quartet / divertimenti, divertimentos, however you want to pluralize it. Take your pick. The bottom line is they were early works composed in the 1750s and 60s or early 60s, somewhere around there, the 1750s. And they have 5 movements. They go fast, dance, slow, dance, fast. They are lovely, lovely works, which nobody plays. Why? Because they're considered early Haydn, and because the language of music was not at that point as sophisticated as it would later become, as Haydn actually made it. But the interesting thing about talking about all of the Haydn quartets, and beginning with these works in particular, is that the string quartets are arguably even more important in terms of what they did for music than the symphonies are. In the string quartets, Haydn experimented with a greater range of forms, you might argue, deeper and more profound, variety of expression and melodic types and all kinds of things, because there were things you could ask 4 players to do that you couldn't ask an orchestra to do in Haydn's day. Nowadays, orchestras are so virtuosic and so well trained, the possibilities are almost limitless. But in Haydn's day, where you had no rehearsal time and orchestras were very small, and the range of ability from one player to the next was huge, and you were never quite sure what you were going to get, Haydn's orchestral style had to be, of a necessity, more conservative than what he was able to do in his string quartets, where he had, select players, much greater control over what 4 soloists could do than like an entire string section. So in any case, we're going to find in these quartets just an amazing range of musical possibilities. And it's really in the quartets, rather than the orchestra music, where the language of the classical style was perfected, that Haydn perfected. And, I don't have time to go over them. You'll see that I've done talks about individual quartets, and I'm going to do lots of talks about individual quartets. I did the Opus 54 number 3 quartet in C major, possibly Haydn's most fascinating quartet formally. And I'm going to talk about a lot of them, over the next bunch of, years, hopefully, that I'm doing these videos. Maybe we'll talk about all of them, like we're going to talk about all of the symphonies individually. Who knows? But for the meantime, I want to give you the ability and a sense of how to start collecting the quartets, because the sooner you get to listening to them, the more fun you're going to have. I guarantee it. And again, I've already did a video on the Opus 20 quartets separately. I've talked about the Opus 33 quartets in my sequel series. They're going to pop up all over the place because they're just incredibly enjoyable and musically important works. So, as I was saying, we're starting with Opus 1 and Opus 2. They tend to come together in a clump. There are 10 of them. And my choice for Opus 1 and Opus 2 is the classic set because of discographic convenience. I mean, there are lots of other good performances of them, but this is such a handy set. This is with the Tatrai Quartet on Hungariton. Now, for many, 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 many years, the Tatrai Quartet was the only complete set of Haydn string quartets that was out there. The Aeolian Quartet on Decca was sporadically available, but not in a set, not in a box. And they were hard to get. You know, they came in and out of print, and getting them all was rather difficult. Now they're very easily obtainable in a box, complete. And the Tatrai Quartet is still available as a set. But they came in individual, CD sets by opus number, very, very convenient. And they're marvelous performances. Now, the Tatrai Quartet is a modern instrument quartet, but they play with a very lean, wiry kind of sound, which really would not be out of place among period instrument ensembles, except they have the necessary amount of vibrato, and they're really a terrific group. And they did an excellent, excellent cycle of Haydn quartets. And the nice thing about this particular box, which contains the Opus 1 and 2 quartets, is that you also get the short quartet, Opus 42. That's a little mini quartet that Haydn wrote, and it's all alone. It's a singleton piece. It's not part of any other group. So, rather than listen to 500 versions of that singleton quartet, which you could only get with other quartets, this is a very convenient way to get Opus 42. And they also include the incomplete quartet, Opus 103, the last instrumental music that Haydn ever wrote before he put down his pen and was forced to retire because he was suffering from arteriosclerosis. And apparently he was unable to continue composing, which was quite sad. But around 1805, 1806, that was when he had to give it up. And so that was his last quartet. And that's in here too. So you have a little conspectus, if you want to call it that, of Haydn's entire career, early, middle, and late, all in a single box. And it's a wonderful set. So, but basically for the Opus 1 and 2, these are the ones to get. Now, some of you may recall there is also an Opus 3, which has a very, very famous movement, a little serenade movement, and that was very famous as a separate number. And it turned out that those quartets were not by Haydn at all. They were by Roman Hofstadter, who was probably composing an imitation of Haydn's quartets, and very good imitations they are. I personally think we should credit Haydn for them, because then you sort of get more Haydn quartets, and they're very pleasant to listen to. But they ain't by Haydn. So if you see Opus 3 running around, you know they're by Hofstadter. Anyway, after these early quartets, there was a gap, and Haydn began writing symphonies and other things, and he didn't return to quartets for quite a while. And when he did, he was really ready to make an enormous leap in terms of the language of music. And the first two sets of 6 are Opus 9 and Opus 17. Opus 9 and Opus 17 have never been terribly popular. They were extremely important in the evolution of the classical style. And, and they were written, I guess, around the 1770s, early 1770s, I think. And I'm really going from memory now. I probably should have looked all this up in advance and refreshed my recollection, but I'm terrible with dates anyway. So don't ever trust me when I talk about dates. Sometimes I get them right, sometimes I don't, and I apologize in advance. Anyway, Opus 9 these are beautiful, beautiful works. The only reason we don't listen to them is because there's so much else that came afterwards that people regard as more mature Haydn. But it's all relative. It really is. And I enjoy them very much. And the Opus 9 quartets arguably contain Haydn's first truly great string quartet. That's Opus 9, number 4 in D minor. And the performances that I have chosen for Opus 9, let's start with Opus 9, is the Buchberger Quartet on Brilliant Classics. Now, this is a complete set of, they did all the Haydn quartets, which is quite handy to have. And this also includes the 7 last words, which I'm not going to talk about separately because I've talked about the 7 last words already as a separate video. And you'll get the 7 last words in any box of Haydn string quartets, so you don't have to worry about it. Anyway, these are period instrument performances. I like them, though. They're very good period instrument performances. They're somewhat rough and ready, but they're also expressive and often quite beautiful. And in the slow movements, they don't forget to add the vibrato so that they sound beautiful. When Haydn writes cantabile, cantabile means, and contemporary sources tell us this, use vibrato, and you have to. And Haydn was the master of the Adagio cantabile, the singing Adagio, very slow, very lyrical, incredibly beautiful, spiritual, soulful music. It was a Haydn specialty. People do not give Haydn enough credit for his Adagio writing, for the purity and melodic beauty of his slow movements. And some of them are extraordinary, and they start right away in these early pieces. So I want you to hear a little bit from that Opus 9, number 4 in D minor, the Adagio from that quartet. It's absolutely exquisite, and this performance is quite beautiful with the Buchberger Quartet. Here it is. Isn't that lovely? Isn't that just marvelously lovely? But when you get to the finale of Opus 9, you hear music in what we really would regard as the classical quartet style. That is, a certain conversational quality, the interplay between the various instruments, the movement of the principal melodic material from violins to viola to cellos and back and up and down, to the imitation and use of counterpoint. It's all there. The classical style is all coming into place and into focus. And really, this is the quartet in which it happened. And I may do a separate talk just about this quartet at some point. But here, listen to the opening of the finale. Again, this is with the Buchberger Quartet on Brilliant Classics. There you go. Marvelous pieces, huh? And marvelous music, and just no reason not to listen to it, is there? There really isn't. Now, we're going to listen to talk about Opus 17. Now, Opus 17 also has 6 quartets. Many of them are absolutely beautiful. Haydn is still experimenting with form. The other difference in these Opus 9 and Opus 17 quartets is that the opening movements are not always in sonata form, and they're not always quick movements. It's extremely quick movements. Some of them are andantes. Some of them, I mean, I love the formal variety. For some reason that I can't understand, people call that immature. There's nothing immature about it. There's nothing wrong with an experiment, especially one that works, which these invariably do. They're wonderful pieces, absolutely wonderful. And I have chosen for this set, let me see, who's doing this? Yes, the Leipziger String Quartet on MD and G. Now, this is a Haydn cycle. I have no idea at what stage it's at. There are many more individual discs of it out there. But for some reason, and this is an MD and G thing that I've never understood, when they do cycles in series, they do them in all kinds of, they do everything out of whack, in a weird order. So here you've got two discs that contain Opus 17. One of them is volume 11, one of them is volume 12, thank God. But that's volume 11 and 12? What do you think volumes 1 through 10 were? Well, obviously they had to be things that came later than Opus 17, not earlier. It's all out of order. The way in which it's released has nothing to do with a sensible progression from one set of quartets to the next. It makes no sense to me from an A&R discographic point of view. But the Leipziger String Quartet is a wonderful, wonderful group. I mean, a fabulous group. And they do a beautiful job with these Opus 17 quartets. I mean, I keep looking down at them because I look at them and I love these pieces. They're absolutely beautiful. And one of the most interesting things about Opus 17 is that the variety of forms in the first movements is really exceptional. Haydn is sort of figuring out how he wants them to go. In some of these movements, the opening is a moderato, which is, moderate in tempo. Some of them are presto, very, very quick. One of them is actually, I think, an andante. Yes, an andante grazioso. So there's a great deal of variety, and it's music that's still somewhat leisurely. It's not as tightly wound and dramatic as later sonata form would become in Haydn's hands. He was still sort of hovering between the idea of the quartet as a divertimento, as a light sort of serenade-like object, and something totally different and vastly more serious, which was about to happen in Opus 20. Now, I did a whole video at Opus 20, so I'm not going to repeat. Opus 20 is the set of quartets, the one that established the classical style once and for all. They are amazing works, important works, incredibly important works, because they established the string quartet as a medium of great seriousness. Nowhere more so than in the three quartets that conclude with fugues, with strict counterpoint, because that blending of the strict old school with the newest type of expression and harmonic audacity. I mean, these are the things that made Haydn's quartets revolutionary. And they still are. I mean, they still are because it's all so audible what he's doing. There are no tricks in this music. He wants you to hear and understand what's happening in each work, and he writes in a way that you grasp it. And as it's going on, I mean, a fugue is a fugue. But there is so much in these quartets. I mean, I've talked about them already, and you can go look at that video if you want. But for the Opus 20 quartets, I've picked a singleton release by an excellent quartet on Bridge Records, the Daedalus Quartet. There are many recordings of Opus 20, many excellent ones. But I chose this one because, like I said, it's a singleton release by a really fine string quartet, a real sleeper that some of you may not know. It's easy to find, easy to source. It's gorgeously recorded. They're beautifully played. And so I choose the Daedalus Quartet on Bridge for Opus 20. Well, after Opus 20 came Opus 33, known as Gli Scherzi, Gli, that G-L-I in Italian, Gli Scherzi, the joke quartets. These are the quartets where Haydn discovered, although he already knew, but I mean formally discovered, how to inject real comic humor into the language of classical music. Haydn himself said they were written in a completely new style. They were written like 10 years after Opus 20. He waited a long time before getting back into the quartet business until he really had something to say. And the language of music had correspondingly advanced. And when I say advanced, it's not like, well, it was more dissonant, it was bigger, it was smaller. We're talking about range of expression. He's always incorporating new ideas, new thoughts, new emotions, new feelings into his music. And the Opus 33 quartets are hilariously funny. I've talked about some of them, and I'll go through all the jokes at one point. I've promised to do that, and I'm going to, or some of the jokes. They're just wonderful, wonderful pieces. Scherzo, of course, means joke. And in these quartets, Haydn replaced the minuet with what he called a scherzo. And that in itself was a revolutionary move, because it was after Haydn started writing scherzos, and then Beethoven picked up the scherzo, and the rest is history. Ever since then, the dance music in most symphonies and large instrumental works, quartets, chamber music, has been a scherzo. And this was where it first happened in the 1780s, in the early 1780s. And my preferred version is the Apogee Quartet on Ars Musici. This is still around. You shouldn't have trouble finding it. It's absolutely hilarious. These are period instrument performances. They are wonderful and full of exactly the right character. This music has to have character, lots of character. Humor has character, and timing, comic timing. I mean, Haydn was a master of comic timing. Most musicians are not masters of comic timing, and there are performances of Opus 33 where everything gets just blown to hell because the players have absolutely no sense of timing, and they miss the humor in the music. Anyway, Apogee Quartet for Opus 33 on Ars Musici. Next, we come to Opus 50. Now, Opus 50 is another group of sort of consolidation quartets. You know, they are not the most popular Haydn quartets, although the Opus 50 group contains probably one of Haydn's most tragic instrumental works, really dark, tragic piece, the quartet in F-sharp minor, the weird key of F-sharp minor. No one else was writing in F-sharp minor during this period except Haydn. His other great work in F-sharp minor was the Farewell Symphony. That's in F-sharp minor, the only symphony in F-sharp minor in the entire 18th century, and much of the 19th as well. Anyway, the quartet in F-sharp minor ends also with a fugue, and a deeply, darkly tragic fugue. I mean, this is a very, very interesting, almost intellectual opus. And so it's good for people who love to hear development, who love to hear Haydn, having fun with form, his musical forms. Now, the opening, these quartets are nicknamed, they have a nickname, the Prussian quartets. And the King of Prussia, as we all know, was a cellist. And Mozart wrote 3 Prussian quartets as well for the King of Prussia. And boy, what a difference. Haydn's are so much better than Mozart's. Everybody likes to talk about how Mozart's 6 quartets dedicated to Haydn, which came out after Opus 33, are better than their models. Well, Haydn's Opus 50 are about 1,000 times better than Mozart's Prussian quartets. And the reason is because when Mozart wrote quartets, he eventually became a little bit too counterpoint happy. His quartet textures in the Prussian quartets are rather heavy. Because the king was a cellist and Mozart wanted to give the cello something to do, they are bottom heavy. There's too much, arguably, weight given to the cello. And I find them to be rather cramped and much less interesting than the 6 quartets dedicated to Haydn. And there's a real sort of way we know what the relative merits of these things were, and that is that when Haydn found someone who did something better than he did, he stopped doing it. And when he heard Mozart's operas, and when people asked Haydn for an opera, he said, "Don't talk to me, talk to Mozart." Mozart wrote piano concertos. Haydn basically only wrote a couple really mature ones and then gave up. He left the field to the other expert that he acknowledged, but he kept writing string quartets. He had no problem writing his own Prussian string quartets, and these are wonderful, wonderful works. But they are, like I said, sort of connoisseurs' works. Let's not kid ourselves about it. And this is the greatest set of them. This is with the Tokyo String Quartet. Hands down, the greatest set of Prussian quartets ever. And there are very few singleton versions of the Prussian quartets. Tokyo only did these in Opus 76, and they're both wonderful, but I had to pick one for our purposes here, and I chose the Opus 50s because they're much more select and rare, and this is an extraordinary achievement. I remember when it came out, and on a 3-disc set on Deutsche Grammophon, and hearing them and going, wow, this is great stuff. Okay, next comes Opus 54-55. And now Haydn is starting to blend what you might call the popular with the intellectual in perfect equipoise. That's bullshit. Why do I even say things like that? I don't know. Critics always do. You know, it was Opus 54, number 2, not number 3, pardon me, the C major. That was the one I did the video on. And you know, I know you have to come up with something to say about all these things, and they're all great. And so, you know, you want to characterize them somehow, but it's hard. It's hard. You know, astonishing, appalling greatness versus astonishing, appalling greatness number 2. So here is astonishing, appalling greatness in Opus 54 and 55. They're actually one set, but they were published in 2 sets of 3. So I put them together, and I choose the String Quartet on Tachet. Fabulous sonics, fabulous playing. This is my favorite Haydn quartet cycle of all the quartets, and they're all available in these separate, convenient by Opus number separately, so you can sample at will. They are exceptional performances, absolutely fabulous. So that I would rather, you know, move on and just tell you, you know, if you want to get a complete set, my recommendation is String on Tachet, a wonderful independent label that really deserves your support. And Opus 54 and 55 are fabulous. After that, oh my goodness, see, we're getting close here. We get Opus 64, right? Yeah, Opus 64. Now, Opus 64 is, you know, I mean, Robbins Landon, you know, the great Haydn scholar and biographer, called them the apotheosis of the Viennese quartet style. Here we go again. They're all that way. You know, what am I supposed to say? They're great pieces. Some of Haydn's most popular and most famous pieces come from Opus 64, like the Lark. Remember the Lark? The Lark is so cute. You know, the Lark is dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun, is that little staccato tune, da 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 da, and then on top of it you hear the Lark and the high violin, doo 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 da. Oh, I can't do it. And, you know, the Lark comes flying in on the high violin. You know, one of the things that's so fascinating about Haydn, of course, is that, you know, you hear that opening and everybody knows what it sounds like, and everybody loves it, and you know, it sounds like a lark, like a little bird, and it's cute and adorable and picturesque. But what most people don't bother to think about is that you're dealing with an opening theme that is actually a double simultaneous presentation of 2 entirely different ideas. One of them on the lower strings, one of them on the upper strings, one of them short and staccato, the other cantabile and lyrical and long-breathed. There is so much musical substance in that innocent, instantly catchy opening. And nobody, you know, we just don't notice it. And that's as it should be, because Haydn doesn't want you to say, oh my God, look at the musical substance. He wants you to just enjoy that innocent, fresh, joyous opening. And we do, but the reason it sounds so wonderful on repetition particularly is because the substance is there. It's really there. And for Opus 64, I chose the Amadeus Quartet, who did 27 Haydn quartets. Here they all are in a box. And, you know, the Amadeus Quartet seems to be a group that we have largely forgotten about. They were one of the outstanding groups of the second half of the 20th century. And I'm not quite sure why they've been they've fallen by the wayside, but they did wonderful work. The first violinist, who was Norbert Brainin, was that his name? I think it was. Yeah, Norbert Brainin. They were actually German, Jewish mostly, refugees from Vienna who played in London, in Britain, and they have the Viennese style down. Norbert Brainin had a sort of prominent vibrato, which some people objected to, and which I actually in the Lark is wonderful. I mean, it all depends on the piece and it depends on your personal taste. But he had character. He had his own personality. The quartet had its own distinctive sound. I think their Haydn style it's not soft and mushy. It's not schmoozy Viennese. It has that classical linearity and leanness and even ruggedness that it needs to have. I have no problem with the way they play Haydn. I think it's quite beautiful. And I think Opus 64 is some of their best work in Haydn or anywhere. So, after Opus 64, we get Opus 71/74. Again, this is a double opus because they were published in two sets of three, but it was one group of 6 quartets that Haydn wrote entirely together. Oh, and there's a motorcycle starting up outside. Sorry. In the parking lot in the back. So, Opus 71/74. Here is my historical choice. There are not a lot of quartets that did great Haydn historically, I have to say. And it's kind of ironic because, the period instrument folks tell us that historical style was non-vibrato and it was all very similar to what they claimed to be doing. And yet most quartets, historically, the earlier ones, did not record Haydn because he wasn't considered a serious enough composer. And they didn't play him terribly well. But one quartet did. Actually, there were a couple that did. But I think for my purposes, 71/74, because the sound is really good. And I think these performances have just held up tremendously. The Griller Quartet. This is on Vanguard? Yeah, Vanguard. Again, easily available still. Wonderful performances. No exposition repeats. That will drive some people crazy. And I wish there were, really, because Haydn, especially late Haydn, as this is, wrote with the understanding that the repeats would be observed. You're supposed to do them, and the music is designed to do them because he deliberately keeps you guessing whether it's going to go back, whether it's going to go forward, what's going to happen. I mean, he writes with the awareness of the repeat in them, which is something that many composers never did. I mean, even Beethoven. Beethoven has some of the worst repeats in the world, like the first movement of the Eroica or the first movement of the Seventh Symphony. Just when it gets really rocking, it goes back to it's awful. They're terribly, terribly designed repeats, and it's not really a mistake to leave them out. From a musical point of view, you can make a very good case for it. Haydn, you really need to do the repeats if it adds something. Let's put it that way. If you do them, and they don't. But I'm sitting here dogging these performances while I'm recommending them at the same time. Why? Because they are fresh and lively and exciting and fabulously well played and interpretively intelligent, and the slow movements are to die for, and the music itself is absolutely wonderful. These are billed as Haydn's first concert quartets, composed to be played in concert halls, in the same programs as, for example, his London symphonies. And so, they work quite well in larger halls. They're not intimate in the same way that the Opus 64 quartets are. They're for a bunch of people in public. And so the music itself is bold and strongly projected and full of, folk music and Haydn's classic, drone basses and all the things that, show his absorption of the folk tradition, both Irish folk songs, which he would spend a lot of his time making settings of, and Hungarian music and all that stuff. You hear elements of all that stuff in Opus 71/74. They are wonderful, wonderful pieces. Next, Opus 76. Almost done. Now, Opus 76, they date from the period after Haydn's London journeys, when he had returned to Vienna and was basically working on his own. And it is his last 6 opus, or 6 work opus. There are 6 Opus 76 quartets. There are some amazing quartets in Opus 76. Here we're talking about, late Beethoven territory, where Haydn is beginning to embark on a language of complete freedom, astonishing total formal mastery and fluidity. Two of the quartets, the last number 5 and 6, have first movements, for example, where Haydn has abandoned sonata form in those movements. And as a first movement, he's going to reserve it for the finales. He's going to start once again, as he did with Opus 9 and 17, which is again why poo-pooing Opus 9 and 17 is such a mistake. He's going to start experimenting with what the very language of music can express, and even go further than he himself had taken it up to that point. And they are wonderful. But one of the most amazing things, I think it's number 6. Oh, yeah. Opus 76, number 6, has a second movement. It's marked Fantasia. Fantasia Adagio. Now, always pay attention to Haydn's slow movements that are marked either Adagio or Capriccio. There's a Capriccio in Symphony number 86, one of the Paris symphonies. And there's a Fantasia in Opus 76, number 6. These are pieces of incredible, almost Brucknerian spirituality and harmonic audacity. Opus 76, number 6, the slow movement, is so harmonically interesting that it has no key signature until the very end. Haydn he writes it effectively in C major. There are no sharps or flats because he's indicating each one individually. That's what that means. You have no idea where that music is going to go. And following it on its journey is one of the great experiences in all music. It really is. We'll do a separate talk on some of these pieces again, as I said. But for my money, the best version of Opus 76, not the best, one of the best, there was that Tokyo Quartet, which is on Sony, as I said, but the Takash Quartet on Decca, a beautiful, beautiful set of the Opus 76 string quartets, glare and all. I think this is a wonderful, wonderful set. They have continued doing some Haydn quartets on Hyperion. They did Opus 71/74, also extraordinarily fine. And, they're one of the great quartets currently going, and their Haydn is absolutely superb. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. However, Haydn composed 2 more quartets, Opus 77. As I said, he also wrote 2 movements, Opus 103. That they would originally have been part of the Opus 77 set. He wanted to do a set of 6, but he wasn't able to finish. A tragic thing, but at least we have the 2 Opus 77 quartets, and they continue the evolution that we heard in Opus 76. The thing that's so amazing about these quartets is that each opus marks a stage on a journey. You wouldn't say that the later ones are necessarily better because you can't improve on perfection. They're perfect of their kind. But the language of music under Haydn is continuously expanding. And Haydn, there was a very famous quotation from Haydn for his biographer about music generally, and he says something like, and I'm paraphrasing very roughly, "Oh, how much remains to be done in this wonderful field of music, even by somebody such as I have been." He was always looking forward, and you hear it in the string quartets in a way which is somehow more immediately audible and obvious than the symphonies. Because in the symphonies, first of all, there's more of them. There's 104 or 107, only 68 and a half string quartets. But even with 68 and a half string quartets, because they come in, easy to manage groups, you can hear him. I don't know. You just notice it. What can I tell you? And Opus 77 is no exception. Here, the minuets, which he hadn't called a scherzo since Opus 33. He still called them minuets, but they're really scherzos. They're really fast and Beethoven-like, unbelievably Beethoven-like. Some of them are in Opus 76 too, but here he really nails it. And my choice for Opus 77 is period instrument group, the Quatuor Mosaïque, possibly my favorite period instrument quartet. They are a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful group. And they did some great Haydn. If you get this box, this is a 10 CD set. You get Opus 20, Opus 33, Opus 64, Opus 76, Opus 77, and the 7 last words. in a box on Naive inexpensively. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to start listening to Haydn on period instruments, along with the Buchberger Quartet too, I think. I mean, that's much more recent and very good in its own way too. But these guys show that period instrument playing doesn't have to be ugly and raw, and it's always beautiful. It's beautifully weighted. They have Christoph Qua, the cellist, on the bottom, and there's a sort of bottom bass upward oriented sonority. I wouldn't call it bottom heavy. I would call it balanced. You know, he has a resonant, beautiful cello tone, and it really, really sets up the entire texture of these quartets. And it's particularly fine in Opus 77, because in Opus 77, Haydn is writing with a sort of top to bottom sonority in these works that's really quite special and incredibly beautiful and affecting. And so I choose the Quatuor Mosaïque for Opus 77. And with that, we come to an end to the ideal Haydn list. Do you want to go through it one more time just for fun? Let's see where we wind up. Let's go backwards. Opus 77, Mosaïque. Here we go. Opus 76, Takács Quartet. Opus 71, 74, the Griller Quartet. I love these. I really do. They're quite wonderful. Opus 64, the Amadeus Quartet. Opus 54, 55, the Aurin Quartet on Tatchet. Opus 50, the Tokyo Quartet on DG. Opus 33, this is the Apponyi Quartet on Ars Musici. Opus 20, the Daedalus Quartet on Bridge. Opus 17, the Leipziger Quartet on MD and G. Opus 9, the Buchberger Quartet on Brilliant Classics. And finally, Opus 1 and 2 with Opus 42 and 103 thrown in at no extra charge. Here we are where we started, the Tatrai Quartet on Hungariton. And that, my friends, is a list of 68 and a half of the greatest, most enjoyable, most expressively profound, most historically important pieces of instrumental music ever written. In fact, I would say they are. There is no more important, expressively profound, historically exciting, thrilling, fun to listen to, enjoyable group of instrumental works in all of Western music. So there, you have to have the Haydn quartets, and you spend a lifetime with them. There's no rush, no hurry. Dip in anywhere, you will be enchanted, mesmerized. It's just a sure thing. So keep on listening, folks. There's plenty to listen to in the Haydn quartets. Take care.